Today we're going to talk about astronomical gravitational energy. If an object of mass m is thrown vertically upward with a speed v0, how high will it rise? This is a simple energy conservation problem, of course, because we know that it starts with some initial kinetic energy, but at its highest point, right, if this is when we throw it, it has some velocity, and then it goes to some other height, it's at rest at that greatest height. That's what makes it the greatest height, and so it has only potential energy. And so we can just set those two things equal to each other, and we find this result, which we've come across a lot in this class already. We did it kinematically, we did it through forces, now we've done it through energy. It should be kind of a familiar friend now. The height is the velocity squared over 2g. But in reality, things are more complicated. We've been using the formula that the potential energy is just mgy. We've used that potential energy for the gravitational formula for the energy in a system consisting of the Earth and an object of mass m located at position y. But this came about from looking at the work done against gravity and moving the object to that position, and that depended on the form of the weight, which is Fg equals mg. Yet we know that this form for the gravitational force is valid only when we're quote-unquote near the surface of the Earth. Basically, only in situations where you can pretend that the Earth is flat. For real situations, where distances are large enough that the astronomical nature of things comes into play, there's a different force equation. If we have two objects with mass m1 and m2 separated by a distance r, then the force that each exerts on the other is given by Fg equals large g times m1 times m2 over r squared. This is Newtonian gravity, or true astronomical gravity, which we studied earlier in the class, where we know that the constant g is just some known universal constant. It's literally called the universal gravitational constant. It's the same everywhere at all times, and has this value, which is a thing that will be on your equation sheet or otherwise given to you and you don't need to memorize. Just remember it's a relatively small number. Now, it can be shown that this force is also conservative and that we can find a potential energy for it, but that requires calculus. It's not a trivial exercise, and it's far beyond the purview of an AP1 class. We're just going to steal the result, and we're going to say that the potential energy in a true gravitational situation is minus times g times the mass of the first object times mass of the second object over the distance separating their centers. All right, that we have this thing comes out. It comes out from doing an integral. It's not terrible, but it's certainly not something you're expected to do here. Please do note that we use now capital G to indicate that we're using capital G to indicate that we're in the astronomical case, as opposed to lowercase g when we're in the flat Earth case. Some really important notes. This formula is always negative. Everything over here is a positive number. G is defined as positive. The two masses have to be positive, and r is the distance separating the center, so it's also positive. So all of these things in the fraction are positive, meaning the potential energy is always negative. Now, we know that for potential energies, we can set their zeros anywhere we want, but here we're setting the zero to be at infinity, that when they're infinitely far apart, we say it's logical the system has no potential energy. They're not interacting, so it'd be bizarre to say they have some energy with respect to each other. And so we set UG equals 0 there. But because of that, then all the other real things with finite distances have to have less energy than that, because listing something to infinity is the highest it can go. So anything that's not infinitely far away is lower than infinity, so it should have a lower energy. And we can see how that works here. If we raise an object from some height to some somewhat greater height from the Earth, we make UG less negative. If we increase r, we have increased the denominator, so we've decreased this number. It's a negative number, so it becomes less negative, which means we've increased it from what it had been. Exactly like we expect. Lifting an object raises its GPE. There's only one power of r in the denominator. Remember, in the force law, it was an inverse square law, but here it's just an inverse law. GPE falls off more slowly than the force. The AP committee is very fond of testing that you know which of those to use in which situation, so be aware of that. As always, this is the gravitational potential energy of the system. No single object has GPE, right? Only systems have GPE. And the gravitational force is still conservative, so we can use the law of conservation of energy in the appropriate situations, and we'll do that throughout the rest of this video. So, consider a ball thrown upward at speed v0 from the surface of the Earth. We'll neglect air resistance and any effects on the Earth's spin. We could find the maximum height the ball would rise using energy conservation. This is the same kind of problem. The ball starts at distance re from the center of the Earth, i.e. it's one radius away from the center, and ends some distance, which is re plus however high it flew. Of course, at the maximum height, the speed is 0. So when we set up our energy conservation, that the initial energy equals the final energy, we have the initial potential energy with this weird form, but there we go, plus the initial kinetic energy, which is this, equals the final potential energy plus 0 because it's not moving. And then we solve it for h. And you should look at this equation and think, I could solve that for h, even though I don't want to, even though it's not a thing that would be particularly fun. It's not that bad as an algebraic exercise, and you could do it. But don't bother. The formula that's about to come out is useful for illustration, but really not for problem solving. It turns out that the height that something goes to is going to be re times the speed squared over this weird fraction, which is the difference between 2gme and v0 squared. And seriously, do not memorize this formula. It is not of any interest to anybody for real, but we're going to use it for the next couple of slides. Plotted below, we have the max height as a function of the launch speed, where orange shows what we get if we use the naive g equals 9.8 throughout, and green showing the true calculation. For small speeds, and notice that's less than about 1,000 meters per second, or less than about Mach 3, 3 times the speed of sound. So small does not have to mean tiny. It can be any real-world human speed. For those kinds of speeds, the two graphs are virtually identical. You can't really even tell that there's a green graph until you get out to, say, maybe 600 meters per second, something like that. As we increase the launch speed, we see that it has that there's more and more difference. And we can see that the green diverges quite a bit as we get out to like 1,000 or so, 10,000. Here's 5,000 or 10,000 meters per second. And the object is going much higher than we would have predicted based on the flat Earth condition. Why is that? Because as we throw it, it gets further from the Earth, which means the force of gravity decreases, which is less effective at slowing it. So it goes further than you would think. The truly interesting thing, though, happens when we make the speed larger and larger. There comes a speed for which the max height becomes effectively infinite. This is funny. I don't know how autocorrect gave us biomes. It becomes effectively infinite. The object never comes to rest. All right, we can see that here. There's an asymptote at some speed where the curve gets more and more and more, but never gets past that asymptote, like reaches infinity before getting to a higher speed. But if it can get to infinite height, that means that anything less than an infinite height, it still has some velocity. It has not yet come to rest. And if it never comes to rest, it can't come back. It goes on forever. If it never comes to rest, it can't turn around to fall back down. And notice that if we want something to come back to the Earth, it needs to reverse its velocity, and the first thing that has to happen is it has to go through zero velocity. So a thing which was launched at a speed equal to or greater than this dashed line will never have that point. There'll never be a point where it turns around and comes back. We say the object has escaped the Earth, and the speed for which this happens is called the escape speed. You'll often hear escape velocity, but I agree with your textbook on this. It's better to remember that it's a speed. There's no directionality in here at all. Finding the escape speed is relatively easy. We could go over to our expression for h and set it to infinity, but that's pretty hard to remember because that's a weird formula. Instead, let's go back to the energy equation and just say that the initial energy equals final energy, so the initial potential energy plus the initial kinetic energy is the final potential energy plus the final kinetic energy. We'd like it to come to rest, so the final kinetic energy is 0, and we're going to set the height to infinity. But of course, any finite number over infinity is essentially 0, so this whole thing has become 0 plus 0, saying that the final energy is 0, meaning the initial energy was also 0, which kind of offends our sense, right? The thing is moving, we're like, it has to have energy. And it has energy, it has some kinetic energy because it's moving, but it's deep in a gravitational well, so it has negative potential energy, and they happen, for an escape orbit, they happen to just cancel. Then we can do some relatively simple algebra and find that the escape speed is the square root of 2 times g times the mass of the Earth divided by the radius of the Earth. For something that's launched from the surface of the Earth, that speed works out to be about 11,100 meters per second, which is 11.1 kilometers per second, which is 6.9 miles per second, which is something like 24,800 miles per hour. So you can see why this isn't something that occurs to you very often. It's way faster than anything happens on the human scale unless we put a lot of effort into it, like with very large rockets. Notice that the mass of the launch object is irrelevant since mass canceled out. Anything given that speed will escape the Earth. Also note that it is a speed, not a velocity. No matter which way you aim the object, as long as you give it the speed v escape, it will escape, assuming its path doesn't hit the center of the Earth, to hit the Earth first. And what I mean by that is, we have done a analysis which assumes that the Earth is a point at its center. If you were to fire the rocket like this with the escape velocity, it would have an escape path, but that path might fall into the Earth before it got out. And so because the Earth is not truly point-like, you could crash into the Earth, but you're not technically trapped because your energy would be enough to get away if there wasn't all this rock in front of you. All right, so try here. Find the escape velocity in meters per second for a rocket from the surface of Mars, given that Mars's mass is 6.32 times 10 to the 23 kilograms, and Mars's radius is about 3.4 times 10 to the 6 meters. And we can do the same analysis, but replace the Earth with Mars. Of course, that means that we get that the escape velocity from Mars is square root of 2 times g times the mass of Mars over the radius of Mars. Throwing in all those numbers, it looks like I might be missing a factor of 2 here. The factor is actually only missing in the equation here. When I typed it in the calculator, I had it right. So either way, when you plug the 2 times g times mass of Mars over the radius of Mars, you get just about 5,000, a little over 5,000 meters per second. So just somewhat under half the escape velocity for the Earth, which means it takes something like a quarter as much energy. Coming back from Mars is much easier than going to Mars. There's sort of a neat trick that the committee is fond of about the energy of an object in a circular orbit that's maintained by gravity. We know the gravitational force must be providing the centripetal acceleration, so we're able to say that F sub g is ma, right? F net equals ma. F sub g is g times mass of one times mass of the other over r squared, and this ends up being mv squared over r. So I can solve for mv squared to be this collection. And you're like, why would I do that? And at first it's not obvious, but it's nice to have mv squared, because we can do the energies. We can talk about the total mechanical energy, which is the kinetic energy plus the potential energy. And we see that we put a half mv squared plus the minus gmm over r that we're used to for potential energy now. But mv squared is also this thing, so we have 1/2 of this thing minus this thing, minus a half gmm over r. But that's just minus the kinetic energy. So the total mechanical energy of a circular orbit is the size of the kinetic energy, but negative. And that implies that the potential energy of a circular orbit is always twice the size of the kinetic energy, but negative. And that can be useful. The committee is fond of asking things about circular orbits like that, so it might be something you care about. Since for an escape path the total energy is 0, but for a circular orbit it's 1/2 of u, we conclude that an object in a circular orbit already has half the energy it would need to escape. Science fiction author Robert Heinlein once summarized this by saying, once you're in orbit, you're halfway to anywhere. Half the energy you're going to use to get to anywhere is going to be used getting up to orbit. And that's an interesting economic fact for space travel. All right. Anything that falls to Earth from deep outer space will hit with just about the escape speed, since it starts at basically zero kinetic energy and starts with, of course, zero gravitational energy. This means objects that come from space having a much larger velocity and thus much larger kinetic energy than you expect. For instance, if a person of mass 65 kilograms were to fall from deep space and hit the ground, with what kinetic energy would they hit? As a reminder, the escape velocity from the Earth is 11,100 meters per second. We do the simple calculation. It's just kinetic energy is a half mv squared. Throw in these numbers and we get 4 gigajoules. We get some staggering amount of energy. This turns out to, in fact, be just about the energy released by detonating 1 ton of conventional explosives, like a World War II blockbuster bomb or something like that. People would be weapons of mass destruction if you could drop them from orbit. The moral of the story is there's a lot of energy available gravitationally. A little bedtime story to be told is, in paleontology, it's known that the Earth's surface puts down sediment at a relatively fixed rate. If you know how deep a sample comes from, you can reasonably date its age. At what's called the KPG boundary, the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary, there is an abrupt disappearance of species, really disappearance of their fossils. Below that line, there are lots of dinosaurs and contemporaneous species, but above it, there are virtually none. And the KPG boundary is very, very thin. In a geological sense, it happens in a very short time, maybe 1,000 or 10,000 years. And we're talking about millions of years ago. This boundary is 65 million years deep, so this is a very small slice. Just as importantly, in that thin transition layer, paleontologists have found a high concentration of iridium, which is otherwise rare on Earth. It's a literal rare Earth material. It is not found very much above or below that line. It's not found on Earth very much at all. But it is plentiful in asteroids. So around 1980, some paleontologists, led by Luis Alvarez, proposed that the KPG boundary was caused by the impact of a large asteroid on the Earth. That released a huge amount of energy, killing much life outright, and then causing a climatic shift that killed off much of what had remained. Something like 80% of all living animals, including almost all of the dinosaurs, were all wiped out within about 1,000 years, possibly by this impact. The energy released in that impact is estimated as being about 10 to the 24 joules, which is about 20 billion bombs of Hiroshima, the things used to end World War II. There is some physical evidence for this. A crater remnant has been discovered in the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico, in a place called Chicxulub, where you can see there's a very small, maybe 10-meter depression, but it's perfectly circular, and oceanography indicates that it goes out into the ocean. And impact remnants have been found there, and interestingly enough, found on the opposite point on the Earth, the so-called antipodes from this crater, where fragments came back down after being ejected during the superviolence here. To be fair, modern paleontology is still engaged in a fight over whether this is the only thing that killed the dinosaurs, but almost everybody accepts that there was an impact and that it played a major and possibly final role in their ultimate demise.